we had to move this schedule a bit so that we can still have the opportunity to have a presentation from Ari and Eva. Eva Birkenstock and Ari Benjamin Meyers have been running a course this year for the summer school program. Duet today had also public, let's say, performances scheduled in 3 locations in the city of Prishtina, which were simultaneously organized. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to join them for similar public performance and research-based work in Liverpool North. Tonight, we will have very brief presentations from both of them, showing us their practice individually. I'll just read something very fast from Eva's bio, and you have the text in the space. I asked you to please get them and check more about the work. So, Eva Birkenstock has been producing exhibitions, performance, and publication projects since 2007. Her work is characterized by its collective nature and its focus on the interrelations of diverse discourses and models and modes of working within the cultural field. On the occasion of the course, she has presented past projects with particular focus on time-based formats within and outside the exhibition space. Thank you so much for being here and for the presentation and the work that you did during the course. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Vala. It's a great pleasure to finally be able to come to Prishtina. I also have to thank Ari that he proposed to me that we work together on this workshop. Which is very exciting because in my curatorial practice I'm very much interested also in artistic research. Sometimes in some projects I really turn out to be the research assistant of the artist I'm working with. It just happens naturally. So it's great now, when Ari approached me to ask if we should do this workshop together, it was really great to kind of use one work and from within think about things like the relation between the performer and the audience, thinking about how performance can be a tool of getting to know a place, to think about the relation of between staging something in different contexts, but also as using performance as a tool, as a language and a tool for education and a dialogue, basically. So, and this worked out really, really well. I'm sure Ari will say something more about the duet work later. We just had the performances here on different sites. It was a bit like a mini festival. We worked from side to side, and I think everybody had the chance to. All the performers had many people who they could sing with, and it was really, really a great experience. And I also have to thank all the fantastic students we had. It was a wonderful group. And now I'm happy to have the opportunity to present a couple of projects I worked on without Ari. I have been working as a curator since more than 10 years. I think one thing which always, like looking back, things seem to make sense. I never planned to be a curator. I studied culture anthropology and, I have to set the timer, sorry. Culture anthropology and art history and Spanish in Cologne. I started, I spent a year in Havana in Cuba, and then in Berlin. Also, I didn't write my thesis about contemporary art, but about the culture and social consequences of HIV/AIDS in East Africa. I had a field research in Tanzania. So, in a way, when I studied art history, I was really only dealing with the different periods. It was really historical and not really connected to a present. So, for me, cultural anthropology, even though I didn't want to work in an NGO or as an anthropologist afterwards, was a super important tool to get into the discourses of ethnicity, of gender, of post-colonialism and so on, which are all kind of then pop up in my practice. And for me, the space of contemporary art then kind of was a space where I could bring those different interests together. I've never been here, but then it's nice, of course, you always make connections. I have to think a lot about the Prishtina house by Marietta Pottage, which we showed in Hamburg in the Kunstverein show once. And when I was talking to Albert, we figured out that we must have been on the same bus in Ramallah doing a project called Limited Spaces, or the Ramallah Biennial by Charles Eschy, and Galit Eilat was also doing a program parallel. And then he told me, yeah, we also showed the mobile archive of the center by Galit once here in Pristina. And then I said, well, I was one of the initiators of the project. And it's basically my very first exhibition I ever did. I had been doing my traineeship in Hamburg at the Kunstverein with Yilmaz Givio. And after 2 years, he allowed me to do a show as well. Since I had studied cultural anthropology, he sent me to Israel for research. I was there 2 weeks in the Israeli Center for Digital Art in Holon. And they had this archive of video works which kind of, they had open calls in Israel but also in the bordering countries for artists to deal with the conflict and the situation. And so every night I went home with 20 DVDs and got into this complex field and tried to make a picture of it through diverse videos and video works and approaches, which was really, really intriguing. And when then in the further conversation, Galit and Eyal Danon, who's now I think the director, and Galit Elat is not there anymore, we were then thinking, okay, what do we do in Hamburg? The idea was, and there 3 weeks, and then we kind of develop a show to bring to the Kunstverein in Hamburg. And one part of the show was a presentation of video games which they had been showing there, video games which all deal with the conflict from different Arab countries and Israel. Of course, lots of ego shooters and so on. And in the other space, I really wanted to bring the archive to this video archive to Hamburg, because I experienced myself it's such a great way of getting all those ideas on this complicated situation. So then the conversation went on, and we kind of thought, okay, but we don't want to just bring the archive and bring it back. And the idea came up, let's make it the mobile archive, and let's have an archive which travels from Hamburg as a first station for 3 years to different institutions. And it should also be not also for the Center in Israel interesting and the other context, because none of us believed in the archive and as an enclosed unit of truth, but as something which is subjective and changing, and where you can take out things and recontextualize them. So this is when this first exhibition of mine started in Hamburg in 2007, and we presented then for the first time. Those was all the DVDs which were part of the archive. Now it's many more, because I think since 2007 it has been traveling to many places, and the main idea is that everywhere it stops, the institution can put in up to 20 more works basically. And so, yeah. And it was here presented as an open video library and with screening programs and discussions and so on. But this was one of the things which I had to think of when I was here. And then the second thing was, it was really nice to go to the to Stacion and see the exhibition by the Museum of American Art, because after Hamburg I was for 2 years or 2.5 years the director or co-director together with Hannes Leuchinger of the Halle für Kunst in Lüneburg, which is also close to Hamburg in the north of Germany, a very, very small Kunstverein, but it's nice because it's very closely related to the Department of Cultural Studies there. So, and we then invited at some point as one of our first projects there, actually the Museum of American Art for a project. And Lüneburg is very close to Hanover, and in Hanover is the Provincial Museum, and in Provincial Museum is the abstract cabinet by Lissitzky, but only in a reconstruction. And there was a very, very interesting museum director, Alexander Dorner, for a time, who kind of was one of the first ones to think about how one could present art in different ways. And Lissitzky was living in Hanover back then, and he invited him to find like a way of displaying the art of his time, the abstract art. And this is when the abstract cabinet appeared, but it was then very quickly then destroyed by the Nazis and declared as entartete Kunst. So I think the Museum of American Art had different ideas. It was similar like here. It's a contextualization of the activities of Dorner, also of the times where the abstract cabinet arose, and also of the times where it got destroyed and why, and what was the art context. So, and the other one was to create a color picture of the abstract cabinet, because there's no color picture, only black and white images of the cabinet with the original hanging, which Lissitzky did, and it's not possible to restage this because the works are all destroyed. So, as you maybe know, after you saw the show at the Museum of American Art, the Museum of American Art has a collection of dilettante fake paintings, and this is how we could restage this abstract cabinet, and we're like painting all the things with the students and so on. And yeah, those were like two projects where I thought they're also interesting because I realized now looking back, even they're very 10 years ago or something, lots of things which I'm interested in, they're still kind of represent, I would say, like working in collaboration, having research-based shows, context-specific, and so on. After Halle für Kunst, I moved on to the Kunsthaus Bregenz, where Yilmaz Giver then was director and asked me to come because he wanted to. The Kunsthaus had like, it's a very small town, Bregenz. I guess nobody knows it here. It's a 60,000 inhabitants. There's no university, there's no art school, but there's this Zumthor Temple of Art, which is an island, and it's not that art is not a topic in this region. Architecture maybe, and so on. And yeah, but it's the capital of this federal state, and there's money, and they really believe in culture and give a lot of money into it and build the Kunsthaus. And the first 10 years of the Kunsthaus history, it was mainly doing really big solo shows in all its 4 floors for mainly male blue chip artists. And I think Yilmaz, coming from the Kunstverein in Hamburg with Kunstvereine, I'm not sure how familiar you are with this. It's an institution particular to Germany. It had been all founded around 1830. It started 1800 by bourgeois people of the cities to present the art of their time, and they're really more for younger artists. It's between the museum and the art school. They don't have collections, they're experimental formats, they have very small bureaucratic infrastructures, and it's more like a space for solo shows, for experimentation, etc. So coming from that to the Kunsthaus, Yilmaz then implemented in the ground floor a different program and asked me to take care of it and not to show, not the project space, but really always go to the borders. And like I work with architects, with theater places, I made summer academies, I made performance programs throughout the whole city, because sometimes I really wanted also to get out of this temple and kind of get in dialogue with the city. And so this was why I moved there. Maybe just like this project I thought of now, I mean, I went like to prepare this talk, we only have each 20 minutes because then we have to leave and share the time because we don't have a shared practice, so we have our own presentations. But so I went through my exhibitions and also to connect to some of the discussions which have been going on here in the last days. You talked a lot about artistic research, and you talked a lot about archives and different approaches of working with archives. There were also talks which in particular were dealing with feminist visibility or non-visibility and so on. So I thought to present this project quickly, which is a project by Ulrike Müller, who's a very, very great artist from Austria, living in New York since many years now. But this is not her painterly practice, but she has initiated this project which is called Her Story Inventory, 100 Feminist Drawings by 100 Feminist Artists, which is also a project of translation and of archival practices. She went to the lesbian Her Story archives in Brooklyn. It's like a very small archive by volunteers run, which kind of archives the history of feminist activities. Of course, it's an archive for stories which normally are not archived and so on. So it's an archive of ephemera, of posters, of stickers, and all those kind of things. And she found, like, being the really amazing T-shirt collection, where, like, from the last years with all the prints and so on. And then she found a list which described all the T-shirts by like a anal archivar, and who wrote like very poetic descriptions of the verbals and signs on it. And then she was very interested that those are already all kinds of translations of the T-shirts of those times and activities and activist moments, and then then already like a textual translation. And then she started a next level of translation. She invited 100 artists she was befriended with to take part in a drawing experiment and send them all one of the sentences, and they were supposed to send back one drawing which is letter size. That was the only thing. And this then she presented once in the Brooklyn Museum together with part of the collection. She scanned the collection for objects which deal with bodies and sexuality and put them in relation together. Here you see now an image of the Kunsthaus Bregenz, where we also created a space with the yellow square which got turned, so it got this triangle on the wall, and that was all nice coincidences, because of course the triangle is also very relevant if you think of ACT UP and so on, and also it's a symbol which also is a lot in the drawings. So we're basically you see now how this archive become also like a tool for like artistic production and to think about queer feminist practices today, basically. I have to hurry up, I guess, but just so in Bregenz as well, one thing which is maybe important for me is also working always with display and thinking about how to present works and why and so on, because this is already for me a very important decision. So we realized quickly that we don't want to put this queer feminist scene, which is like a self-organized scene and so on, in this big institution directly on the wall, but we wanted to generate an own space for it. And then all those weird things happen. I had a friend in Cologne who has a shop for these tapestries from the time, so we tried to, with the tapestry and the plants, make maybe a connection to the 60s and 70s, and then on them have our own walls for the drawings. And then we also wanted to make connections to the town and went into research in the local museum. And we thought maybe we find objects there which are related to the body or to sexuality or to gender in some ways or the others, but then we realized the only thing we found were torture instruments and things of oppression, and thought this is also not the right way to put so then we went to the collection of the Kunsthaus and found this wonderful work of Maria Lasnik and put this on the wall of the institution to create a dialogue to it. Okay, this is just one. Okay, I jumped through this. It's a performance work with Dora Garcia, and I always was looking for reading groups in Bregenz, but I wasn't really lucky. I only found one after lots of research by a group of psychoanalysts who were practitioners, but were already in their 70s and not working anymore, and they, since 30 years, had been reading Lacan every week, and have also, every other week, and the other week they went to Zurich. They're these two reading groups. So I invited Dora Garcia, I don't know, maybe you know her, a Spanish artist, and she had just done a really wonderful video on Finnegan's Wake and a reading group in Zurich who since 30 years read the same book, James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, and I think they're now, and they told me they're for each run through they need 10 years. Out of those coincidences, I of course tried to connect then Dora with the reading group, and then it was clear that there's a very late lecture by Lacan which speaks about James Joyce. It uses James Joyce to develop a symptom theory, and those were then the elements we kind of worked with, and she did the symptom score and opened the back door, and we had performers performing the whole time the symptom score. And this was also nice because we really managed to get performers from Bregenz, professionals, who all then were reading or dancing toward each other. Also, I switch a bit to performance because besides doing the Kunstverein For, then the Kunsthaus Bregenz, I had been curating four iterations of the performance project of the Liste in Basel. It's an independent performance project. I collaborated with theaters, and as what we did here, also sites scouting and so on. I try to develop new works with the artists I work with mostly, and also try to find sites within the city, and I think only mostly one performance was actually happening on the fairground. If this wild situation is at all productive for the work, if not, we went to other theaters by the riverside, whatever the work needed. And so this was also, I guess, the reason why this made sense that we work together on the project here. Yeah, this is just performances. I jumped through this because now we are at the Kunstverein in Düsseldorf. The Kunstverein für die Rheinlande und Westfalen. It's in the same building as the Kunsthalle. This has historical reasons because after the Kunsthalle got damaged in the war, and Hildebrand Gurlitt, maybe you know him from Documenta latest, he unfortunately was one of my predecessors at the Kunstverein. He was director there. And he was very much involved in the city politics, because of course after the war he immediately got a job as a director at the Kunstverein. This happened of course to many people, as we all know, in Germany. There was also no ground zero basically. And then lots of the city politics ran through the Kunstverein basically. So the Kunstverein, Gurlitt died then in the 50s, but the person who was the director afterwards was then really very much involved in rebuilding the Kunsthalle, and so the institution was planned with hosting those two institutions within one building from the beginning. Yes. There you see the poster of Alicia Franco, one of the first shows. Maybe I just mention Alicia Franco is an artist from New Zealand. She works a lot with performers. She's very much intrigued or interested in the post-humanist discourse. And for the exhibition, though, we also tried to find a way of translating her time-based practice into an exhibition parcours, and finding that the exhibition had a time. It was 16 minutes and 52 seconds, because there was like a light guiding the visitor through the room. Video started and stopped. It was more like an animated exhibition, so it was not that there were actually performers or bodies performing, but the exhibition itself became like an automated performance, and the performance happened then in other days. This is a work by Johannes Paul Rether. He is also a performance artist, like maybe another example where we try to find ways to find a format within the exhibition. He called himself an identitect, since he always has invented all those characters which become research units. He has Transformella, the Queen of Debris, who's interested in questions of reproduction, or Protectorama, who's thinking about the relationship of the human being and technology, and how we more and more become the prosthesis of our computers, laptops, etc. So here we found a space for her switch, where the visitor took one of the sticks and had like a soundscape which kind of guided him through the space. That's a performance at IKEA about reproduction, but now I think my time is almost over. I have 2 more minutes. Well, maybe we talk so much about the archive. Maybe as a last project, I show you the asymmetrische Architekturen, asymmetric architectures. When I came to the Kunstverein half a year after I started working there in September 2016, the institution turned 50, or the architecture turned 50, and so the Kunsthalle was doing a program, and I also had to make something up. And of course it's really, really nice when you start working at a place to, in the beginning, involve into the whole history of the institution. And the Kunstverein in Düsseldorf was founded in 1829, so it has like quite a long history. We have 3,000 members, and all the archive is at the city archives. So we then started a whole research project, and I then decided to look actually at this post-war times of the Kunstverein to really because that's what's kind of the conditions in which the building was built, and it's also inscribed in the building. So we unfolded all those different narrations and conflicts which happened at the time around the building of the architecture an exhibition, which was basically Katrin Meyer did this display architecture, which also is made out of carton or papier-mâché, which stick like it is like. You can put it together in different constellations, so it doesn't have anything static or ended. And then we took different topics out of the archive to create like a whole long research project, and where new productions came, and old artworks and ephemera came into contact. Yeah, I think now I have 20 minutes. So you got maybe in this really quick presentation a bit an idea of some of the interests of my work, and I hope at some point we can elaborate. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being brief and very concise at the same time. Yeah. So we continue with Ari Benjamin Meyers. This is the second time that we collaborate together. Ari lives and works in Berlin. He received his training as a pianist, composer, and conductor at the Juilliard School, Yale University, and Peabody Institute. Trading the concert format for that of the exhibition, his works as an artist, such as Kunsthalle For Symphony 80 with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra and Solo for Arium, both 2017, explore structures and processes that redefine the performative, social, and ephemeral nature of music, as well as the relation between the performer and the audience. I will not make it longer. You have text in the space. I just have to mention one important detail. Course duet by Ari and Eva was also supported by our partner institution Dam Festival. A partner institution also for administering the boxing club where the public program also is organized. Ari, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if maybe I don't know if anyone here is. Well, there are some. Maybe for those of you old enough, do you remember Mission Impossible? Yes. Not the films, the TV show. I remember it. I used to watch it. And the TV show Mission Impossible, basically every episode was an hour long. They did a lot of crazy stuff. They pulled off something, and every episode ended the same way. The team would like meet up after pulling off some amazing, and the guy driving the car would like come with the car. The car wouldn't even stop. They would like jump in the car, and the car would speed off, and then that great bum 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 bum. That's what I feel like tonight. Maybe when we run off, someone can give us the great music because I have a half hour and then the taxi comes and we go to the airport. This is the modern artistic practice somehow. It's anyway. But I also will start really quickly because we can't stay, it's a shame we can't stay and have a drink and say thank you. So I'll say thank you very quickly to Albert, to Vale, to the whole team. Like Albert said, it's my second time at the school. It's my third time in Prishtina, my second time at the school. And it's always like a really interesting, amazing experience. I also want to thank the great group that we had. Really, to come together in 4 days, create the performance duet, have it happen in the city, have people join, and really have all these experiences. Also yesterday in Mitrovica, it's really very special. And then I also want to thank Eva for doing it with me. I kind of now I've almost made a decision that if I'm going to do a workshop about my work or about the performance work, I really feel like I'm only going to do it ideally with Eva, and I was going to say with a curator, because the thing is, if I talk about this performance work and we start to feel like it's natural or it's understood or we're really only getting half the story, because there are still so many issues around doing, in my case, music. Specifically doing performance in the contemporary art context. So I kind of feel like, especially working with students, it's so important to have the curatorial side, because we have to know about the practice, the working conditions, how does this work, how do we pay the performers, how can we, and I really reached a point where I almost feel like it's not, it's not right if I only talk about that one side of the work, that we really need to include both. And so I was really happy to be able to do that here, to not just talk about the work, create the work, but also have the kind of connection to the art institution through a curator, and then like a great curator like Eva. So I'm not going to talk about the work that we did here, duet. In fact, I would say it's even better that I don't talk about it. I'm going to talk about the Kunsthalle For, which is an ongoing institutional project of mine. Duet is somehow a part of that, and I would just say that there's about 6 or 7 people here who performed duet today and yesterday, and I think that's the best documentation we could have. I'm not going to show photographs or videos or anything, but I would really invite those of you who are able to stay and not jumping in a cab in a half hour to speak with them if you're interested. I mean, I know they all had really very differing experiences, and I think, again, to me it's the best kind of documentation, a kind of oral social, let's say, kind of documentation. So they're here, please talk to them. Maybe if you're very lucky, who knows, maybe a duet performance could even spontaneously take place. So I'm going to give this talk. It's a very condensed version of a much longer talk. I hope I don't run out of time. I'm just going to try to introduce the Kunsthalle for Music in a kind of brief way. So I am, in a way, I'm speaking to you now as the founder and artistic director of Kunsthalle for Music. Maybe some of you have heard of it, maybe some have seen it, I don't know. I think there was someone here who told me they were in Rotterdam and saw it, but I'm sure most of you are hearing about it now for the first time. In any case, I want to give a short introduction to the Kunsthalle for Music, describe a bit of its history, how it came into being, and perhaps more importantly, why it came into being. The inaugural exhibition of the Kunsthalle for Music closed a little over a year ago, but in fact it's not a project of the past, but very much right now, in the present, and in the future. Further iterations are planned this summer, well, in about a week or so, at the VAC Foundation in Moscow, and then it's going on to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santa Barbara, and then we'll also be at KW Berlin next year. But the Kunsthalle for Music is a proposition for a new institution. As such, it is right now, as always, in the process of becoming, existing momentarily and nomadically, seeking some kind of permanence, but perhaps also never really existing. Therefore, for me, it's exciting to be able to talk to you about it now, not as a fait accompli, but as another moment of the institution instantiating itself. And I would just like to note here that this act of constantly and continuously becoming, that this process is itself a musical one. So let me start at the beginning with the first manifestation, the inaugural exhibition of Kunsthalle for Music, which took place at Witte de Witt in Rotterdam and ran for 6 weeks. The show essentially consisted of three components, and these would be the ensemble of 8 musician performers who enacted the show every day it was open, the repertoire that they performed, and a series of 4 commissions that were newly created by 4 artists working directly with the ensemble in situ at Witte de Witt. So let me very briefly talk about each one of these components. The ensemble, as I said, consisted of 8 musician performers. In fact, they were not all professional musicians, but rather a mix of professionally trained musicians with different backgrounds side by side, with artists, dancers, and performers who had a strong musical element in their practice and our background, but could best be described musically as amateurs. This is perhaps one of the biggest taboos that the show broke, certainly from the music side, this mixing of professional trained musicians together with musical amateurs. And because an important aspect of the Kunsthalle's mission is about questioning and basically removing the veil of perfection and preciousness that surrounds contemporary music performance, this was a very necessary step. The instrumentation consisted of piano, cello, 2 violins, 2 saxophones, electric guitar, drums, and we also sang and had some electronics. The ensemble was chosen in a long casting process that took many months, and the final ensemble was only put together after a series of group workshops where different configurations were tried out. For the coming show, I just mentioned in Berlin, at KW, we're going to work with the same ensemble again for the show in Santa Barbara. We are right now in the process of creating a new US-based ensemble from scratch, which is not so easy, but that's happening right now. So for this first exhibition of the Kunsthalle for Music, I created something called the Songbook, And this contained all the repertoire for the show that the ensemble played. By repertoire, I mean here existing musical works by composers, musicians, and visual artists chosen by myself and contributed to the Kunsthalle, that we either took as they were or adapted in some way. Yeah, it's probably hard to read. This is a kind of a partial list from the repertoire. And these works come in many different forms, classically notated scores, but also as instructions, diagrams, texts, etc. I won't list all the participants now, but just mention included composers such as Paulina Oliveros and Julius Eastman, who are deceased, sadly, but also younger composers such as Wojtek Blechacz and Leah Letzel. And from the visual art side, we had musical works by artists such as Yoko Ono, Christian Marclay, Henri Salle, Hassan Khan, Sungwon Kim, and Superflex, just to give an example. The final component to the exhibition were the 4 commissions. These were done by the composer Jonathan Bepler, who you might know. He does all the music, or most of the music for Matthew Barney. He did all the incredible music for the Cremaster films. The artist duo Libya Castro and Olafur Olafsson. And this is also some slide each of their commissions. The US art rock band The Residents. I don't know if we have any Residents fan here, but this was like a kind of labor of love for me. And the artist Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster. I would like to point out that the realization of these commissions took place as part of the running show. In other words, the work between artist and ensemble, the rehearsals, these all took place publicly during the regular opening hours of the exhibition. And I would say that this highlights another very important aspect of Kunsthalle For Music, which we also got into very much in our workshop with Duet, and this is the breakdown between performance and rehearsal, or rather an emphasis on the process of music making in its entirety, as opposed to the limited and incomplete idea of a music performance existing only in a final and unchanging state, i.e. a concert performance or a recording. So now that I've described very quickly the content, let me go backwards a little bit and just trace the history of how this first manifestation of the Kunsthalle came into being and what led up to it. The first time I used the phrase Kunsthalle For Music in print was in an interview with the art historian Marie-France Raphael that later became the book Music on Display. This is what I said there, and this is the quote. Quote, "In today's classical concerts, there's very little room for this, for the unrehearsed, the so-called extraneous, or the contingency, even, or one could say especially, within contemporary music performance practice. We need the Philharmonie, or La Scala, in all of its perfection, like we need museums to display the old masters, but we also need another kind of space for contemporary music performance that hasn't really existed until now. Let's call it a Kunsthalle For Music. We as composers and musicians haven't traditionally had this playground as we know it in contemporary art. As a composer, I feel a strong pull towards a non-goal oriented musical space, the Derive. An art space, of course, has its own rules, but it's still a place you can navigate at your own pace." And it was this book and this sentence that Daphne Ayers read, and that led to the invitation at Witte de Witt. Daphne Ayers, some of you may know her, she's a curator, and she was at that time the director of Witte de Witt. She got in touch and asked me if I would like to realize this Kunsthalle For Music. You don't often, or at least I don't often get phone calls like that, so of course I said yes right away, before she changed her mind. And actually I looked up the email where she first wrote me, and it was essentially around 3 years ago, more or less today. And about 6 months after that initial exchange, I released via eFlux, just to talk about eFlux, hopefully without too much international art English, the manifesto. And I would like to read it. I'll try to go through quickly. So this is the Kunsthalle for Music Manifesto. Music is not necessarily what you think it is. Can we imagine a space for music that exists outside of any media and beyond the stage? A space for unrecordable music, music of undefined duration, existing even when no audience is present. A dissolution of performer and audience, of rehearsal and performance. A music existing in the world based in a space of musical action and activity, production and performance that can be entered into and exited from at will. A space wherein the ideal listening and viewing position is determined independently by each artist, performer, or visitor, not determined beforehand by a seat number or a ticket. Having an ensemble at the center of its activity, carrying out or otherwise enacting the work, which continues during the opening hours, whether there are visitor present or not. I think the actual manifesto is a bit longer. That lays out the basic themes. I think you can read it, it's online, it's still available via eFlux. I think I'm going to skip ahead and move to sort of the next important step in the Kunsthalle, and that was a symposium that we held at Witte de Witt. The symposium took place May 25th to the 26th, 2017. It was called Music is Not, a symposium on and around the Kunsthalle for Music. The title, which is taken from the first sentence of the manifesto that I just read, is intended as a kind of positive, productive negation. At the symposium, we brought together artists, composers, curators, philosophers, and theoreticians to discuss the Kunsthalle for Music proposal. Among them was Peter Osborne, and I'm sure many of you here know him. He's the director for the Center for Research of European Philosophy at Kingston University, and among other books, Anywhere, Not at All, Philosophy of Contemporary Art. And he gave the keynote talk. And he picked up this idea of negation that I had in the manifesto. And it was quite an important talk for the project, so I want to just summarize what he said about negation. I'm going to start with his third point, because it's the one we can most quickly kind of discard. And his third idea of negation is, quote, the negation of music as such, not merely in its historically developed forms, but in principle in all conceivable forms. So this one we have to get rid of because it's the nihilism of it doesn't lead us anywhere. It's a dead end. But now if we go back to the first negation that he proposes from the title, he says this is, quote, the negation of what music currently is via the negation of one or more of what are taken to be its currently essential predicates. Now this is very interesting because this is essentially the negation that has produced contemporary music. In other words, negating through alternative compositional strategies one or more aspects of music and or music making that were at one time or another deemed to be essential for understanding something as being music in the first place. So this would be atonality, or later something like indeterminacy. But the failure, as Peter Osborne sees it, and I agree with him here, of contemporary music to be truly contemporary lies precisely with this piecemeal approach. For example, it is certainly a paradox of some kind that even the most radically atonal and complex music is still performed in a concert setting that has changed very little over the last 100 years. In other words, the institutional framework was left intact, and so was its function as a determining factor in keeping up a particular idea of music writ large. Which leads me directly to Osborne's second idea of negation in regards to the title of the symposium. It's this second negation that is of particular interest because it pertains to the Kunsthalle for Music directly. Music is not, Osborne went on, could be more correctly interpreted as the negation of music as a whole in its historically developed totality as it is currently understood. So in other words, neither a complete negation of all music nor a selective adjustment of particular compositional strategies, but in fact a reframing, a total reframing that includes not only the sound of the music, but its presentation, its institutions, its educational systems, and production models. This is the reframing that the Kunsthalle for Music is attempting. And one critical element of this attempt has been to reframe this whole within the context of what we think of as contemporary art. But now you may ask yourself, why? Why not approach this negation within the field of music itself? Why a Kunsthalle for music? There are multiple answers to this question, each with its own trajectory. On one level, it's an extremely personal project that comes directly out of my own biography. In the manifesto, it talks about the Kunsthalle operating within a schism, and I would say that I myself have two large schisms in my background, and that much of my work has been about or around that. The first one is not very unique. Many of you might know this, especially the musicians here in the audience. And for me, it involves reconciling the music that I studied, first as a pianist, then a composer, and later a conductor. And this would be, of course, what we call Western classical and contemporary music, or even worse, serious music. Reconciling that with the music that couldn't be studied, music of the moment. In German, they say U-Musik. This would be rock music, experimental music, etc. And at a moment now where it seems that almost every young composer has his or her own band, and when only last year Kendrick Lamar's Damn won the Pulitzer Prize, this division may seem somewhat antiquated, and in many ways, happily it is. On the other hand, if you go online and see the reaction to Kendrick Lamar winning the Pulitzer Prize, which had before been awarded almost exclusively to large-scale works of contemporary music, you can see that the battle is in no way over. But particularly at the time that I was studying music and composition in the 90s, this divide was extremely entrenched. And this first schism and attempts at reconciliation, I would say, was the strongest influence on my work for the first 15 years or so when I was working professionally as a composer. The second schism is the one that leads more directly to the Kunsthalle for music. This is the schism between contemporary music and contemporary art. I'd like to describe two fundamental moments that brought me to that and to the context of contemporary art. The first is quite organic, and it stems directly out of the direction that my work and compositions were taking starting about 10 years ago. And an early example from that time is a work of mine called Solo. And the idea behind Solo is actually quite simple. It's a composition for an opera singer performing for one audience member in a very small room. And the whole piece takes about 15 minutes. It's written out in a normal way. The score contains instructions for the singer involving her choreography and positions in the room. Her relationship to the single audience member is integral to the piece, to the composition of the piece. It cannot be performed in any other way. And so, as you might imagine, it was very difficult, in the end, in fact impossible, to have this work performed in any of the standard venues or opera houses. This is, of course, because the economics of music making, any kind of music making, whether it be pop, jazz, classical, experimental music, is quantity-based, i.e. selling the maximum number of tickets or records or downloads to the maximum number of people. So, of course, I had a problem with Solo. But interestingly, around this time, I had one of the first possibilities to show a work in a gallery setting, and it was a revelation to see that in this setting, there was absolutely no problem with the setup of Solo whatsoever. In an art context, it was simply a performative installation for one audience member at a time. It was performed in a loop, people waited their turn, and it worked perfectly. That was a very important, you could call it object lesson for me moving forward. The second key moment for me that happened around this time was being invited to become the music director and composer for the group show Il Tempo del Postino. This show, Il Tempo del Postino, was a group show curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Philippe Carreno. It involved around 15 artists creating works for the opera stage and employing all the means that an opera house has to offer: an orchestra, set design, costumes, etc. So essentially a group show of visual artists presented as a kind of bizarre opera in many parts over the course of 3 hours. The preparation and work with the artist on the scores and the pieces as the music director, so I was responsible for the composition, for the arrangements, for everything musically. And that for me was something like going to art school, because I didn't go to art school, I went to music school. But this intense period of time, sort of spending time with these different artists, was like a kind of apprenticeship of some kind. And this is also where I worked with many of the artists with whom I would later continue to collaborate, like Tino Sehgal, Henri Salle, and Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster. And so where this was a show about bringing artists to the opera stage, this is also when I started thinking about how could I bring music into the art context, into the white cube. And here's an example of duet in the white cube. And now that I've mentioned the white cube, which of course for many artists is kind of like the proverbial elephant in the room, or more like the elephant that is the room. But you know, where I come from, coming from performing arts, as I mentioned above, the white cube for me is nothing more or less than an empty space where I can kind of do what I want. Of course, the white cube finds itself within certain institutions like the gallery, the museum, the public collection, etc. And it is precisely because of certain artists who have pushed and expanded and even rejected notions of these institutions that there is this kind of freedom. These artists and works and gestures have come in waves over the last 60 years and fall under the heading of institutional critique. In comparison, music has not had its institutional critique moment. It simply takes place where it takes place, and that's almost always a concert hall. There's certainly been a lot of complaining about it and some fiddling with the format or presentation, but these adjustments are minor, mostly aesthetic. There's been no fundamental artistic movement in music that would systematically analyze and criticize the conditions that govern the production, presentation, and perception of music as their artistic work. And so this was a central aspect to me in the creation of Kunsthalle For Music, the creation of a new institution as a critique of the existing institutions on both the music and art side. To the extent that it's not a neat fit, and I can tell you all that it's not. Fissures and cracks are created in existing structures and institutions, and I think this is a small but very necessary first step. I'm just checking the time because I wanted to show a short video, but I don't know if we really have time. Or I could also like let the video run and I could sneak away, something like that. And of course, then I avoid all questions, I avoid all critique. It's actually a very brilliant. It's a very brilliant move. But so maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll kind of finish. I'll push play. And just to finish by saying that what I've tried to do very, very quickly is give a background of the Kunsthalle For Music, describe a bit how it functions, provide some reason for coming into existence, and taken all together, this generates a set of interesting problems and yet another set of questions, like what is music, what is art, what is music as contemporary art, and what for? Does Kunsthalle For Music reflect back to the field of music or to the field of art and exhibition making? Is it a new institution or is it a work in itself? And to what extent is it real or fiction? I haven't tried to answer those questions, but I think they're a good start for a conversation to be continued, not now, but I hope at a later time. Thank you very much. And yeah, I think, yeah. Thank you.
And goodbye.
And goodbye.
What happened?
Computer. We try again, no? It could be a little softer, maybe it's a bit loud.
Speak loud. I cannot thank them because they left. But we give a 10-minute break and then we continue with Sami Khatib. So 10-minute break. I hope Sami's course today also went well. Today we have a cooler weather, so maybe it helped. So tonight's presentation is called Space of Critique. If I'm allowed, I'll just read briefly something from your bio. So Sami Khatib is a cultural theorist and philosopher based in Berlin. He's a founding member of the Beirut Institute for Critical Analysis and Research. He taught and engaged in research at the Free University in Berlin, Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, American University of Beirut, and Academy of Fine Art in Vienna. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. His main interests are in critical theory and aesthetic theory. Please check more with the text that is provided. There's also an abstract of his presentation. Sami, thank you so much for your collaboration. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. Is this working? Yes, or? You all know? Is it better? No?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much, Albert, and thank you, Vala. Thanks to the entire. No, this is. Don't do this. Not yet, I would say. On Saturday, maybe. Thanks to the entire team of Stacion. Pleasure and honor to be back. I think already the third time. Thanks to Boris, I think you involved me here at some point. Didn't you? I think so. No, it's great to be back, and I'm also happy to speak on the topic basically of this week's class. This week, the class I'm teaching, this year it's always a theory class. This year it's called Why Theory, Criticality as Commodity. Basically a talk that developed out of a certain uneasiness or even a suspicion that I encountered by myself when reading texts that made a very, very strong gesture towards criticality, as if you earn €1 every time you mention the word criticality. And then I got even more suspicious and asked myself, since when people use this strange word criticality? In good old days, bad days of course, it was only critique. That was how I was educated in, like boring Kantian German tradition. Then we switched into from the discourse from French and German to English, where you have two words for critique. One is being criticism, the other one is critique, but still it's pretty close. And then at a certain moment, criticality emerged as a new term. So the first version of that talk was actually presented last year in Ramallah at the Khalil Sakakini Cultural Center, where a good friend of mine, also artist and the artistic director, Yazan Khalidi, invited me to give a talk on art, or what does art exhibit, and this was the first version. Since then I reworked it a couple of times, and so this is already like a fifth version of it. I'm not yet fully happy with it. I'm still reworking it also in the course of the class that I'm giving here this week. So let's do this correctly. I read from here and click on this one, hopefully not the other way around. I called it actually the space of critique. I wanted to connect the argument on spatialization, which is another paper, and another argument with the argument on my reading of criticality. I'm not so sure whether this works. For the moment, I start with the first part, criticality as commodity. In her article entitled From Criticism to Critique to Criticality from 2003, Edith Rogoff made a following observation, and I quote, and you can also read this with me. Instead of criticism being an act of judgment addressed to a clear-cut object of criticism, we now recognize not just our own imbrication in the object or the cultural moment, but also the performative nature of any action or stance we might be taking in relation to it. Now we think of all of these practices as linked and in a complex process of knowledge production instead of the earlier separation into creativity and criticism, production and application. If one shares this set of perspectives, then one cannot ask the question, what is an artist, without asking, what is a theorist? Reading these lines in 2019, we could claim that Rogoff's observation has become a normative claim that is shared by most art historians, art critics, and theorists in the field of contemporary art. The practice of writing within the field of contemporary art is theory that displays, performs, enables, shares, proliferates criticality. And vice versa, by the way, the text that I was quoting from also was published in a different version. It was called What is a Theorist? And the earlier version of this text was called What is an Artist? So it's actually the convertibility of what is an artist and what is a theorist, and the point of conversion, or of where they come the closest, so to speak, is the term criticality. To put it the other way around, contemporary art is theory insofar as it contains criticality, the magic substance that makes the contemporary of art, which otherwise is considered merely crafts and skills, or local art, or goes to the museum, and it can be archived. But contemporary art contains a certain degree of criticality. But what is criticality other than the question of critique and criticism? And again, let's not forget that in the French and German language, and also many others, both meanings are covered by the same term, meaning critique or critique, and also not forget the Greek root krino, krinein, which also relates to crisis, so it's the same root. Nevertheless, here is a split in the meaning in the English language that is already that already has a long modern legacy between criticism and critique. And now comes the third term. I made this kind of chart that I more or less distilled and copied from Rogoff's article. So we have classic modern critique and also art criticism, which is modern. It's a self-reflective activity. You remember probably the Kantian discourse, but also the early Romanticist discourse. Those who sat in my course this week won't be surprised with this listing of what is classic critique and art criticism. Positive and constituting, providing grounds of critique, is concerned with its own limits, the limitations of critique, measuring out, that is the classic discourse of Kant's first critique. It's the judgment of an object, or the very form of judgment, of judging an object, also judging art. Again, that is very famously linked to Immanuel Kant, here the critique of judgment, the third critique. It's immanent critique, so it's a kind of textual practice, it's a critical philology that is based on the idea that the object, the text itself is critical, and what the critic does is basically to just unleash, to unfold, to just trigger that moment of critique within a text. You don't bring critique to the object is critical already. So it's implied and enabled, enabling by and through its object. So criticality, if you want, which became more fashionable, or also was coined as a term in the post or late postmodern age, It's more ironic, subversive, it's undoing any grounds, any claims of grounding critique, and it's not based on the authority of critical judgment. You can add a couple of other remarks on or sets of predicates, which would be, it's related to a fluid, performative, singular practice of art, and quite strikingly, criticality has its, let's say, strongest reception and strongest career, if you want, in the world of art, especially art theory, contemporary art theory. It's not so fashionable in critical theory itself, but it's coming, so to speak. And I already read some text in German where criticality has been translated as Criticalität. I don't know what it means actually, other than critique, but it's already there. And probably it can be mapped according to those other interesting signposting words. You can follow this in English, of course. Position is positionality, direction is directionality, subjectivity maybe still makes sense, but you can follow up until it gets a little bit silly also, where you don't know what the reality actually means, other what the original meaning means. But I don't want to ridicule this discourse, I want to see it as a symptom and a certain impasse and a problem that is probably articulated here. So, despite these assumed differences, criticality, I mean, the chart, you have a set of differences. Criticality seems, at least at first sight, much closer to the disavowed and misunderstood traditional notion of critique, known since Immanuel Kant and the German early Romanticists. That is, critique is the positive, affirmative, and also negative activity of measuring out, exploring, and overcoming the limitations of thinking, but then also of acting, performing, and so on. It's basically kind of a testing out the limits and grounding, self-grounding, so self-reflexivity, a certain field of knowledge, performance, activity. First, it was in the realm of thinking. According to this more or less Kantian tradition, critique has always been understood as self-reflective vis-à-vis its own activity, infinite and by nature incompletable in terms of its end and goals. It's an activity. It's not something that is prescribed from A to B, how to get from there to there, but it's an activity that goes, in theory at least, into infinity. Because it is motivated by its own subject matter, the work of art, the object of critique, which also can be a text, of course. Following this radical modern, even modernist, yet somehow quite traditional Kantian and post-Kantian understanding, the critic is not the sovereign instance of authoritative judgment, but merely an operator or an extension or an attachment to the movement, the trajectory, and the direction of critique. The critic basically has to serve the process of unfolding the immanent critique of its object. It's the caterer. It's not the one who determines that, and it's not the one who brings a critical attitude to the world, to its object. So the critic and his or her position is necessarily implied in the self-reflective act of criticizing and being criticized. So this would be broadly understood the quite classy modern understanding that is here also for you on the left side of the chart. In contrast to this conceptual genealogy, the postmodern neologism of criticality, as introduced and popularized by the American art critic Donald Cuspitt, belongs to a different discourse and genealogy. The term initially emerged in the English-speaking discourse of art history and critical theory, where it was turned against a flat understanding of the role of the critic as it were, a white male Western producer of truth, authority, and validity. However, with regards to Rogov's understanding of the term, it seems that criticality just tries to reinstate the radical thrust of the formerly known traditional Kantian concept of critique without claiming its Enlightenment baggage, the Western humanist form of subjectivity. So when I'll give you also I promise I will give you some examples of other takes on criticality. The suspicion that I got while reading more about criticality was that some of the, let's say, more interesting predicates of what critique used to be anyways in the modernist tradition, but had been forgotten in a certain Anglo-Saxon, US-American dominated discourse, are being offered to me or resold to me under the etiquette, the label of criticality. That what I thought or I had learned was critique anyways. So something must have happened to critique in the meantime, so that there was, let's call it, an intellectual market that received criticality so well. So let's take a closer look at criticality and why it promised something new to the postmodern intelligentsia and art world of the post-1990s. Something contemporary that outdated modernist art criticism, you may think of Clement Greenberg, and then later on, maybe the October crew, couldn't deliver anymore. In order to do so, I will not discuss Greenberg and American modern art. Of course, you better go to Stacion headquarters, right? There's still the exhibition that you can watch on American modern art. But go a bit further back in history. And I excuse my class, of course, the course will be bored because we already had this yesterday. But just very briefly, I repeat this. So around 1800, the early Romantic or proto-modernist concept of Kunstkritik, art criticism, held that the condition of possibility for any critique is grounded in the limitations and in the possibilities in the trajectory of the work of art itself. The producers of art are not critics themselves, but their works provide the critical ground for critique, which in turn is not conceived as a negative appraisal, finding some problems or mistakes in the work of art, but a positive activity of completion, of consummation of the work of art. Hence, art and criticism, or more broadly speaking, art and theory, participate in something bigger than either field. They partake in the uneven movement of the infinite self-reflection of art as a maturing process. That means adding layers and layers, you can say resonances on resonances, mirrors on mirrors of historical meaning and unfolding of a work of art. Art criticism, as claimed by Walter Benjamin in his take on early Romanticism and Friedrich Schlegel, Novalis, and so on, is an extension of the work of art, infinitely completing itself in the medium of its own reflection. A short quote from Benjamin: criticism of a work of art is rather its reflection, which can only unfold the germ of the reflection that is immanent to the work. Therefore, no external criterion can be given concerning the question of what art is and what counts as art. For there is no absolute distinction between the function of the critic and the artist. They both serve the work of art and its infinite unfolding, its infinite reflection. The critic and his or her judgment becomes a moment of the infinite unfolding of the work of art in the medium of historical time, which Benjamin calls the afterlife or fourth living of a work of art. One more longer quote also taken from Benjamin's PhD from 1919, the concept of art criticism, German Romanticism. Of course, in German, you don't have this word criticism, you only have the Begriff der Kunstkritik in der Deutschen Romantik. The criticizability of a work, you can read it, right? Or is it too small? Okay, super. The criticizability of a work demonstrates on its own the positive value judgment made concerning it. And this judgment can be rendered not through an isolated inquiry, but only by the fact of critique itself. Because there is no other standard, no other criterion for the presence of a reflection than the possibility of its fruitful unfolding, which is called criticism, critique. That implicit judgment of artworks in romantic criticism is remarkable in a second way. It has no scale of values at its disposal. If a work can be criticized, then it is a work of art. Otherwise, it is not. So to sum up, the discourse of the early romantic, or others will say proto-modernist, concept of critique and art criticism could think of a third, a medium of criticizability, a historical medium of afterlife, a critical medium of reflection, in order to connect and mediate the role of the critic and the artist. Critique was conceived as both the operator of the work of art's afterlife and the subject of an infinite process of self-reflection in which the medium of critique criticized itself, undoing all stable positions within the situation and position of the critic, the artist and the work of art. It was only when critique became subjected to the subjective criticism of an individual, think of a pre- or post-Greenbergian art critic, that critique could be conceived as an external property attached to the opinion and authority of the critic. To sum it up one more time, basically the idea is that art, or that the author of a work of art and the critic who writes a critique on a work of art, both are serving the inner life, the inner swinging resonance. They become basically the echo chamber of the afterlife, the fourth living of a work of art. Or otherwise it is not a work of art. The center of art critique is the work of art. You can always, in brackets, say is a text. Good to say, could be also a political situation, which immanently criticizes itself because it immanently reflects upon itself. So there can never ever be, in this kind of concept of critique, you never judge on something, you never judge from outside, you're never external to what you judge, you're always mediated. Your position is mediated in that, implicated in that, what you judge on. So basically, you become an extension of the work of art. In the early romantic art theory, this is even seen as a kind of consummation, and of course there are many also slightly outdated and problematic formulations you find in Novalis and Schlegel, but for me it's only important to make a strong point here on immanent critique and of the non-hierarchical understanding of what is the function of a critic. A critic, again, is not the person who has a critical attitude that comes from outside of the work of art or the text to its object. It comes from inside. And the critic is maybe the one who almost like can have like a bow and can touch a string, and then there's a sound, and the echo, the resonance can be proliferated through the critic, but then the critic becomes part of the medium of the work of art. So the postmodern neologism of criticality, now we're back in our times, can thus be read as an answer to this modern deadlock of art criticism, where the critic becomes the source of critique, unlike in Kantian and early Romanticist concept of critique. And if you think about that, you can say criticality, and also if you read Rogov's text from 2002 and also the one of 2007 that followed up on that, criticality is a kind of attempt to expropriate that kind of boys group, old art historian bros, as a hierarchical group who owns critique, because they are the critics, who are the ones who know, and they treat their exclusive knowledge and their form of criticism, their critical attitude, almost as an exclusive cultural commodity. The authority of critical judgment, and this authority is at stake in the strategic move, so to speak, to insert criticality into the discourse. So with at least following the argument that is proposed by Rogov, in postmodernity, with criticality, critique becomes more pluralistic, not anymore limited to the figure of the classic art critic and his or her traditional social, racial, gendered background. In the classical age of critique, and again this is modernity and Immanuel Kant, critique was reserved to a certain domain. It was not seen as individual property or individual commodity. No, it was reserved for public use, not relegated to a private commodified sphere. Let us recall Kant's differentiations between these two domains. I take this from one of, I think, Kant's most famous short essays or articles, answer to the question, what is enlightenment? You probably had to read it at one point at school. Kant offers there a very striking differentiation. He names two uses of reason. First, he assumes everybody has more or less same access to reason, and then there are two ways of using it: private use of reason and public use of reason. Private use of reason is applied, is so to speak applied rationality, where one makes use of his or her own reason in a, quote Kant, a certain civil post or office where one, which is entrusted to him or her. So basically, private use of reason is what also later maybe in critical theory was called instrumental rationality, instrumental reason. Something where, according to its inner logic, you are rational, yet the goals and the ends of which you do not question, because you are in an office, you are in a position, you are in a contractual situation where you basically have to obey, to perform, you have to function. Yet the way how you function is still rational. This would be private use of reason. In contrast to this, Kant offers the public use of reason. For Kant, of course, he was a scholar, as you know, a philosopher. He limited that exercise of public use of reason to the position of a scholar who speaks to the entire public of the reading world, basically addressing the universality of all readers, writers, and generally the non-privatizable realm of language. Everybody. So it's not, you should not misunderstand this though. He's not saying only smart people, like educated people, like Immanuel Kant in 1784 are allowed or able to exercise public use of reason. He says, no, everyone. Everyone has the right and everyone can speak as a scholar, independent of the individual knowledge, to make propositions, to criticize freely, without limits, without regard of the authority. Even the king you can imply in your criticism, as long as you are functioning in the private sector, in your bourgeois duties and your duties as a citoyen, as a member of civil society. So you have to use your reason instrumentally in the realm where basically you have to function, but still you have the right and the freedom infinitely to use your reason publicly. As a public intellectual, of course, if you have the chance, you can criticize, so to speak. And critique, more or less, in the Kantian sense, has its seat in this realm. In the realm where you have a public and you can criticize. There is the side of critique. From here, it's very easy to follow up what happened to critique then. With the privatization of the public sphere, the economization of all domains of public and private life, the space for public use of reason has become very, very narrow in a neoliberal society. Unless you want to risk prison, unemployment, or marginalization, etc., or even death. So, what Immanuel Kant still could do, addressing his Prussian king and saying, "Don't worry, it's very harmless what I'm doing. I'm radically free in my critique, but I'm only doing this as a scholar, and I just, criticize everyone. No one is spared, even religion is not spared. But don't worry, I function in the position I am in the office I'm entrusted with. This position you cannot have anymore. If you try to do this on almost any country, even in so-called liberal Western democracies, if you attack a couple of people, you will have some trouble. If you don't go to prison and you don't lose your job, you will face a certain marginalization at least. So, and you cannot make this Kantian claim anymore. I just spoke as a scholar, it didn't harm anyone. No one got shot or whatever. So therefore, the side that Kant thought as specific to critique, that is making public use of reason, is more and more non-existent. Don't forget the last famous people who made this public use of reason by showing the public something of public interest and concern, namely whistleblower. They are now in prison. They haven't done anything. They just made public use of reason. But however, in a quite un-Kantian, non-Kantian manner, we live in an age of the proliferation of critique under the name of criticality. So my astonishment is the following now. Let's assume the Kantian fantasy of the bourgeois liberal age, where you could, certain people at least, make public use of reason, whether you exercise critique. If this sphere is narrowed down or almost non-existent, how come then that on the other hand, the interest in critique under the name of criticality has proliferated so much that you cannot even do without? The conclusion that I only can offer here is criticality is something that allows for private ownership of critique, and it seems to be the name of critique in a society that only knows and allows the private use of reason. So private use of reason in Kantian sense is not critical, of course, but criticality seems to work. So in a society that is neoliberal, privatized, and of course one of the engineering fields for the economization of society is the art world and the art market. It doesn't mean this is necessarily the avant-garde, but certain forms of economization, individualization of semi-capitalism, and also its tandem partnership with so-called excess financial capital makes the art world a very interesting laboratory where you can see certain symptoms of broader society. So the shift to criticality thus only democratizes the exclusive access to a certain cultural commodity. The commodity of being heard, allowed to speak, counted, being visible, counted as authoritative voice, endowed with critical judgment, and so on. And of course, you do this in a certain language. Boris, you mentioned the Triple Canopy article, which is called International Art English. Of course, that's the language that criticality speaks. So, in a very vulgar abbreviation or short version summary of this argument, you could say, the old feudal, the ancien regime of bourgeois art critics as a boys' club, where they basically already misunderstood the Kantian and early Romanticist notion of immanent critique, made it an oligarchy of access only to a certain group, that this kind of privatization of critique is now being diversified under neoliberal headings. That means you have a neoliberal access to critique under the name of criticality versus the old one that is a more, you can say, oligarchic, corporatist model of capitalism. But in both ways, the critic as the gatekeeper and the criticality as a free-floating signifier as a commodity, in both realms, in both cases, critique is assigned to the sphere of what Kant called private use of reason. Because at the same time, the capitalist attack on civil society, meaning on public spaces and public discourse, has happened. So, in a way, I don't want to give a polemical account of criticality, but more read it as a symptom of our times. So what remains unquestioned, however, following the argument that is presented in Rogorov's short piece on criticality, what remains unquestioned is the commodified form under which criticism, critique, and theory is performed and how its function is perceived. From this angle, the seeming democratization of art criticism driven by postmodern and neoliberal identity politics unfortunately only pluralized access and participation in the field of contemporary art and theory without asking the question of what is being democratized, namely the access to a certain cultural commodity. Of course, if you say capitalism is the only game in town, then your struggle is limited to let's make it more accessible. Let's fight only the discrimination in the field of access to capitalist commodities, because that is anyways the only game in town. But you cannot attack the rules of the game as such. Or with Kant I would say, you cannot even exercise public use of reason, because then the rules of the game would also become part of what you would attack. Nevertheless, then you would have a problem, because you attack the ones who give you money, who have paid you for your criticality, and that can be good for your market value, but can be bad for your market value. You have to, when do you sign a petition? Do you do it on the first day, on the third day? Criticality can go wrong, but can also be very powerful. Who are the ones do you oppose? Find the right opponents, those who are anyways going down. It's like a stock market analysis. If you hit them in the right moment, your criticality index will definitely go up. But again, it's attached to the subject. No? It is something that you are also able to confer to the work of art that you produce. It is the magic ingredient. So in a way then, criticality as cultural commodity became an external attachment to any kind of work of art or text, a fetishized commodity produced along with other art commodities, either as a built-in feature of the work of art or as a supplement of the critic individual. Of course, now you can also say criticality has to be confirmed, has to be brought into the work of art by the critic again. These cases exist. You can think of very affirmative, even boring, you may say, totally streamlined commercial work of arts. But there is also the possibility for the critic now to come back and be the edgy one who say, no, there is a criticality in it, precisely because there is a lack of any critique. This is so critical. You know, of course, this kind of discourse is quite boring. Albert, what is the time? Can I go until, I know it's 8 o'clock.
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay. It's more or less what I planned for. Then I let you go and have drinks. Hence, critical self-reflection, the activity of radical critique of all grounds of criticism, is now attributed to the individual art or theory producer. Criticality as private property is produced and exchanged as an exclusive commodity owned and sold by the art theory producer/curator. This privatization of critique, however, still promises the radical content of traditional critique, now relabeled and redistributed as criticality. And I quote again from Rogoff's text that I quoted earlier. Criticality is precisely in the operations of recognizing the limitations of one's thought, for one does not learn something new until one unlearns something old. Otherwise, one is simply adding information rather than rethinking a structure. That struck me also because I thought, wow, the interrogation and the recognizing of limitation of one's thought, I mean, is something. This was what Kant said. I mean, this is nothing new about it. You can just call it critique by its proper name. You don't need to relabel this. But again, it becomes now something as an individual virtue of the neoliberal self. It's not anymore the activity of critique itself. So in this way, even the critical act of rethinking structure is subjected to a crypto-pedagogical project of self-improvement, self-betterment, increased awareness of the atomized art theory subject, the individual whose judgment proves, performs, validates criticality as an identifiable, detachable, exchangeable, exhibitable, countable, and capitalizable commodity. Almost there. While critique cannot exist without its subject matter and medium, for it is, by definition, a relational limit concept, criticality seems to enjoy an independent existence, which makes it an identifiable, distinct feature. In this sense, criticality can be added to a work of art or theory, either directly as a special ingredient in terms of content or indirectly conveyed by the art theory's production process. Criticality, thus, marks an excess or surplus over the aesthetic qualities of a work of art. Here I will break and stop and let us have drinks and eat. Nevertheless, the argument that comes now is, of course, what is the space of criticality? There is in the longer version a long passage on installation art and on the fluidity of the spaces that are being produced there, and what is basically in which kind of economy criticality as something to enhance a value makes sense. So how this kind of differential distinction can be formed into value in a society where every work of art works functions as a commodity, and where this sphere formerly known as public sphere, where you could make use of public use of reason, has been abandoned. And there was, of course, lots of stuff on Benjamin and Marx, but I skipped this and let you enjoy the beer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, I'm going to switch the mics just for a sec. Of course, we will not let you go away so fast. So I'm opening the floor for questions if everyone has, or any reflections. I can just say that we were counting. He mentioned the word critique or criticality within 1 minute 20 times.
20 euros.
But of course, very, I thought super relevant presentation also for our context, and also how I could 100% agree how critique has been privatized, but of course not everything has been privatized.
You have to say that.
Because, let's say, media, how they function here, they also own critique, and they direct critique based on the interests. This includes schools, education institutions, private schools, and similar. And playing the realm of critique in the public sphere, and I also don't agree that it has been totally abandoned, because some of us still occupy part of it in the public sphere. Just some thoughts to share with you, and to open the floor. Of course, you can discuss even after, but this is the opportunity to share your thoughts with us. If Sami's presentation made you think at all about what he was saying. Okay.
As a first response to you, I could at least say, I'm with you. Let's defend this kind of civil society that still allows for public use of reason. I mean, this would be the first thing to defend, absolutely. But it's under attack, and I'm looking at the symptoms, or how do I measure the degree of attack through an indirect method of a symptomatic reading of a certain signifier, namely criticality, in a discourse which seems not directly political as political action in the public sphere, but indirectly functions as an index of a certain, awareness. You can say, in Hegel, you would say, Geist, spirit of its age, art.
I agree, but also just some, I mean, I'm all the time trying to introduce the context here. You're so brave.
Thank you, Sami. I will first ask the question, but then try to explain what I mean by this question. What do you understand when you say privatization? It is so commonly used today, and in the context of our critical discourse on neoliberalism, we somehow immediately understand what this means. Coming back to the text on enlightenment, as you know, it actually begins with a certain quality subject of critique should have, so as to use reason publicly, which is to their courage.
Courage, yes.
Yes, Semperoper. This is how it starts. This is the first moment. And it is closely connected to the idea of enlightenment. This is the first level. The second level is beautiful that you mentioned scholar, but scholar vacant is defined by his or her address, not address, universality, address. You mentioned language, which means that, and now I'm coming to, we speak English, we use English. When we today say the word scholar, we mean something completely in English, completely different, not what Kant meant. It's not the moment of address, but precisely private position in the institution. It's precisely the opposite. Yes. Another huge problem is using of the notion of space. You have it already in the title. Public for Kant and for German and for later for Habermas, for the late school. It's not simply space. It is for Habermas, after the linguistic turn, it's a language. Public is a language, private is a language. So the difference between so-called spaces is a space. It is difference between private language and public language, but then this is the question of institutions, etc. What do you actually, when you say privatization, and you imply the disappearance of the public, I must say space, but I don't know, the disappearance of the public use, of the carriage, of the etc., etc. What do you actually mean by this privatization and the disappearance of public in the context of subject of critique?
That's a perfect question. This needs to be dealt immediately with, if I'm allowed, or do you want to collect other questions? Okay, thanks for this. Perfect. So first of all, ex negativo, of course. Limitation to access. Privatization means exclusive access to something. Let's not be too quick to define what the access is to. Let's look only on the form of the access. Or to put a bit more Marxian, it's not about the question of property, it's a question of private property. There is also social property, or what other forms of property, or you mentioned it also in your talk. Today we have a lot of talk about the commons. There's a certain regulation about the commons as well, but it can be also a commodity in a certain way, but then the commodity must include the possibility of decommodification. It can be in the shape of commodity today. So what I mean with privatization, I mean commodifying and private exclusive access to, even though if this access is given to many others at the same time, you can pay for it and so on. It should be, of course, if I say privatization, I refer to a reversible process, otherwise it would be tautological. Then I would just restate what there is. There is private property, then it would be proper liberal, which is the natural state of affairs. Of course, it's a reversible, it's a movement that can be reversed, and it is done on spaces that are not empirical spaces, on topologies, on media, space, time, language, bodies, and so on. That are, so to speak, limited in their access to, they are attached to, can be institution, company, or private legal person. So this would be privatization as a broad, as kind of the major function of not neoliberalism, this is capitalism. Privatization, you can say, primitive accumulation, if you want, enclosure. You had all these. You mentioned it in your talk as well. So when the commons become private property in not only the beginning of capitalism, since primal, or let's call it by its German name, original accumulation is a process that never stopped. It is something always again restated in a capitalist society, through the destruction of other non or less capitalist societies. So this would be one way of very broadly linking privatization, not to a moralist lamento over, the neoliberals destroyed our public sphere. Yeah, but who owned the public sphere before, by the way? But to link it to the category of the commodity form and to what capitalism does anyways. The neoliberal onslaught against certain, let's say, insular existences of public spheres in a very limited country, so-called Western democracies, is a kind of undoing capitalist, you can say, anomality. This was the exception, now it becomes more the rule. Privatize, of course, and accumulate. So this is one way. And the other one, I mean, you explained it so beautifully, I can just say, yes, exactly, this is the reading of Kant I would also give. As a scholar, you speak not as someone who had read many books. No, as a scholar, you mean you speak through address. So the moment I say, I am Sami Khatib with such a beautiful Arabic name, and then I give you all of my individual positionality catalog, then I don't speak as. Then I don't do public use of reason. Because reason is trans-subjective. Reason is not owned by the individual. Of course, that sounds very Hegelian, very classic, I would say materialist, but knowledge is not owned by an individual. So if I speak and language speaks me, and I do not use language, but language speaks me, I can never make a positionality argument, because I don't own that infrastructure. And I cannot totalize my position in that infrastructure. So the moment I say, I, Sami Khatib, employed here, getting the money here, my position as if I give you my bank account statement, broadly speaking, I do, by definition, private use of reason. And there I may use criticality as something, but then the realm of critique is cancelled out in the beginning. So if this address is not possible, then you cannot have critique. On the other hand, I must make a long footnote here. Those people who said this in the earlier times were mostly always the same people. And these same people were actually the oligarchy of a certain privileged group of people who spoke in the name of universality and claimed we are just doing public use of reason, but actually we're doing private use of reason. So now you have two ways to attack it. Either saying public use of reason doesn't exist at all, it's all private, then you're proper neoliberal and so on, capitalist. Or you say, then let's get rid of these false universalists who actually camouflage their private use of reason in the shape, in the face of what they claim as universal. Or put it this way, it's an old battleground we have for a long time. Do we need strategic essentialism, or do we need strategic universalism? And you know, I'm on the side of strategic universalism. I see a complete deadlock to abandon this kind of public sphere where decommodification is possible. And I would, of course, say public use of reason is the domain of critique, or critique is not. And if critique is not, I go with the early romanticists and say then there is no art. But of course we know we anyways post art, Hegel, who are the other guys, Kojève. But unfortunately, this dying of our age, this end of history, end of art, and so on, takes so much time. Already 200 years, I guess. Huh? But it takes time. Of course, you can make this argument. That post-historical argument we hear a lot. Yeah, 60s, and then capitalism is the only game in town. So I'm not using this, please don't take this as a takeaway message. I will never use criticality in my work again. My goodness, I have nothing against that word. It's a symptomatic reading of a problem which we can frame in Kantian terms as, is there private use of reason only? And as my position and in society, that means as my job, and also everything biopolitical technologies define me. And should this be the ultimate horizon of my address? And some people say so, and I say no. Then you don't need it, critique anymore, but then I also won't buy your cheap, let's say, relabeling of certain actually quite emancipatory notions of critique, and I don't need criticality then either. This was basically, in a nutshell, the entire argument.
One remark. Do you know that public property is also private property? One form of private property.
Which property?
Public property.
Yeah. It can go from this hand to the other, yeah.
Yes. And where is the difference in the time of Kant and now? Kant is the problem. Kant promotes the capitalism, absolute individualism, the illusion of public is an illusion of liberalism, old liberalism, who now perpetuate leftists in Europe.
You can say
Public is always be private. Doesn't exist public property who is not private property. This is one form of private property. And also in real life, Kant, you know, maybe you read the book of Thomas de Quincey, The Last Day of Kant. Kant tried to make this idea about public domain, and he tried in his home produce the saloon, intellectual saloon, and the result, this is very interesting book, the result, Kant never eat to 1782, eat together with the other people. He eat only in the
morning
restaurant alone. And he tried to produce the saloon to the public domain in his house, and all event is the lunch together with the people, and this is the Thomas de Quincey said most of these people is the English sailor.
You come to Königsberg.
Yes, and the result that in this time, in this moment, Kant became
no, he became famous.
Demented.
Ipsi. Dementia.
Dementia.
In his late years, when he had his fans already, but
yes. This is the result of
age,
how Kant tried to produce the public space. Totally.
We cannot escape age for sure.
Maybe strong food, maybe strong.
Yeah. But thanks for Praniman for putting me. One time in my life, I wanted to be on this defender side of Kant. I always failed. I never could because I'm always on the other side. But you provide me with this chance, and I thank you for that. I mean, for sure, it's a gradual concept, relational concept of public sphere we have in capitalism. Of course, in the end, it's all reversible. The reversibility of public-private applies to the other side as well. Real public space as space of the people, you only can have when you have abolished private property altogether, meaning communism or a non-capitalist future. But let's put it this way. You can read Kant in this way, or you can read Kant in the other way and say, sure, but there are always tendencies in a work that have a horizon that is beyond the horizon of the writer who wrote it. And that's how I read Kant. I mean, for sure, I only exploit those moments in Kant that go beyond his society, beyond, come on, what kind of guy he was. I mean, this kind of Prussian neurotic. And I'm not so interested in him. I mean, he's kind of cute in his age, but what a weirdo. I mean, I would not even, if I had a revolutionary party, I would not even let him be member of it, you know. I would read his books for sure, and also make use of it, so public use of reason, but he better stays at home. We know what he did. I mean, he had always this 5 o'clock tea, walking around the house, and these crazy socks he always had. Like, okay, but I guess you got me, huh? So it's beyond, it's not an absolute judgment on that, for sure. He is of course part of the bourgeois society, but as a good dialecticians we say bourgeois society is the unity or the identity of bourgeois society and what bourgeois society is not yet and also not anymore. Or, you know, you can only state the infinite tautology of capitalism is capitalism, but that is exactly what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. And we would, of course, always disagree with this notion.
Thank you very much, Sami, for this presentation and discussion. It's really very interesting. I'm very curious about what you would have said about installation. Because you brought this in, and it's a kind of discussion about the kind of form we are using now, and it was until 20 years ago still a kind of dimension that was not clear what it was, and now it seems a category. So maybe use it in the sense of category. I'm very curious about this, but I don't know if we have the time to develop this.
I mean, I can refer at least to the article where I do it. I can send it to you, but very briefly, I don't want to evade this question. Basically, I go with a very vulgar definition that I basically more or less steal from Boris Kreuz. The idea is more or less, it's based on fluidity and singularity of a situation. It's something performative, but not exhaustive and performative. It's something where you can do a symbolic privatization of something which is the fantasy maybe of public space, demark it, and this kind of demarcation that you define the space of this installation gives it a singular spatial temporal singularity that you can
experience.
Yes, this is the point. I mean, what you experience there might not be repeated. The funny thing, though, is that the very format of installation art can be repeated. So, strangely, this is one way I'm exploiting. I'm taking this from Jamieson's article, "Aesthetics of Singularity." You have a very strange moment there. You can repeat singularity. This is what you can do with a commodity, and you can sell this commodity as a singular one because it's performative, cannot be repeated. But you precisely this kind of singularity as a set, certain rules, intervention into space, and how do you deal with time, you can repeat as a kind of genre which can become a commodity, which is also a self-critical commodity because this is criticality as intervention into space already. And I link, of course, this kind of aesthetics of singularity to this has inbuilt feature already, criticality. So this was basically the whole argument. It's also not polemical, it's more like kind of how something that Walter Benjamin called so beautifully aura, the here and now that you cannot technologically reproduce, how this can be reproduced and even exhibited. This is the fascinating moment for me, and that's why I had this in a longer version of that talk. There's a long passage on that.
Thank you.
To my course, have you all read this Irit Rogov text I sampled from? Okay, cool. Yeah, I did this one. Me too.
Okay. I guess everyone else wants to make questions after or something. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you questions after. Thank you so much.